I just want to welcome Ian Proud to the show. He is an ex-British diplomat, served as a diplomat for almost 2 decades in Moscow. Really appreciate you taking your time out to join us. How are you?
I'm very well, thank you, Suleiman. How are you?
Great, thank you very much. Thanks for coming on. Now, we've got a number of questions for you, Ian, and we've got you for a very short period of time, so let's quickly get into it. Obviously, you've been a diplomat for a very long time, and part of that is speaking to different parties, negotiating, relaying information. What's your thoughts on how these negotiations are being conducted? It seems quite strange.
Well, the first thing I'd say is I'm glad that the Pakistan government has taken a really kind of important role in trying to bring the two sides together. Hitherto, there'd been little signs from the U.S. administration they wanted to pursue serious diplomacy. What we saw was a series of ultimata provided by the Trump administration, and whenever peace talks did take place, they were followed shortly thereafter by military strikes, which served only one purpose, which was to kill any diplomatic process stone dead. Now, look, diplomacy involves tough discussions between two hugely opposing sides to reach some sort of settlement on areas where they both disagree, right? And that is really difficult. That's actually harder than warfare, where you can just launch missiles and attack ships and attack cities and kill innocent children and that sort of thing. Diplomacy is really, really hard. And I think it's only recently that Trump has shown signs that he's recognized the need to really get into the serious nature of diplomacy. I hope it delivers results soon.
Let's hope so. Now, in terms of the negotiations, we've seen, as you said, there's been negotiations and then there's been strikes. But recently, we've seen two elements of the negotiations. One is the negotiations that are happening possibly behind closed doors. And then we have the negotiations that are happening in the public between Trump and the Iranians. What's your kind of thoughts on how this is being conducted and how harmful it will be to try and get to some kind of resolution?
Well, there are two aspects to this, I suppose. I mean, in terms of Trump and all of his public statements, his main job here is to convince the American people that he's winning, and when he comes out of this, he has won, even though any observer who looks at the details and the evidence and the massive, devastating impact this is having and will have on the global economy would not agree with Trump that actually this amounts to anything other in fact, than a catastrophic failure for the USA and actually for his allies, including Europe and in the United Kingdom. So all the kind of bluster and the Truth Social posts are really aimed at his own domestic audience in terms of saying, well, look, we're doing a great job and we're winning here and we're cut a deal and it'll be the best deal that you've ever seen. You know, the normal kind of Trump stuff. The important work, the really important work is the stuff that happens behind closed doors. All really important and tough diplomatic negotiations should take place free from the public gaze, and that's where they have the difficult conversations about the big areas of disagreement on Iran's nuclear program, on Iran's desire, understandably, for some sort of economic relief, some sort of reassurance that it won't be attacked again in the future, some reassurance against its own axis of resistance allies in the region as well, so that they won't be subject to attacks by Israel, even if it isn't. And those sorts of things. So these kind of negotiations have to take place quietly with calm heads behind closed doors. And I'm glad that appears slowly to be showing signs of happening. And again, I'm grateful to the government of Pakistan for the efforts they've made to try and move this process forward.
Yeah. Obviously, we want peace. But you've spent quite a lot of time as a diplomat in Moscow. What's the view of the Kremlin on this? And what I mean by that is, they're benefiting financially quite a lot. They had the sanctions lifted. They've been able to sell oil, energy. They've become, financially, they've profited quite a lot from this war in the sense of they've not been involved in it, but they've been a beneficiary. But then on the other hand, I'm hearing reports that Putin has spoken to the Iranians. They're talking about new trade deals. But in addition to that, maybe they are telling Iran to kind of hold off a little bit until the meeting in China happens, and they want some kind of agreement. I don't know. What's your thoughts on what's going on there?
Well, Putin probably has three separate concerns on this. Firstly, I think since Trump has come to power, Putin does want to see some sort of normalization of relations with the US. I think that would be good for Russia. I think that would be good for America if that were to happen. He does have a rapport with Trump. That's important to him, getting past this kind of really toxic US relationship, particularly under the Democrats, under the Obama administration, under the Biden administration. Some sort of big reset there, not just on the economic side, sanctions, but also on the kind of bigger strategic issues around nuclear control and that sort of stuff, resolving the conflict in Ukraine and so on. So that's really important to him. Also, I think actually, kind of, Putin's main focus really is on the war in Ukraine. I think there's been huge resistance from the European side to bring that to a close. They've actively blocked efforts to kind of find a diplomatic settlement to that conflict. And the Trump relationship is helpful in that regard too. So that's the second. But the third, of course, is that actually Russia has a really kind of good strategic partnership with Iran as well, and also with China. They're part of the group of nations in the developing world under the auspices of the BRICS, grouping that actually looks to establish some sort of alternative in terms of political, multilateral, intergovernmental kind of dialogue that's a counterpoint to kind of Western hegemonic dominance. So that relationship, both in terms of the relationship with Iran, but in terms of the wider relationship into the developing world and how that's emerging as a counterpoint to US hegemony, is also important. So he's got to try and balance all three kind of factors. I mean, his primary concern really will be about, the war in Ukraine, but nevertheless, he's not going to abandon sort of really strong Russia ties with Iran. Just to keep Trump happy on this, he's going to try and balance, the needs of his ally in Iran and what he wants to see out of his relationship with Trump.
Fair enough. Now, I was speaking to Pepe, and he emphasized how huge it was that President Putin had gone to a meeting to meet the foreign minister of Iran, Aragchi. And he said the significance of that is quite large. And for a president to meet a foreign minister is also quite unusual. What's your kind of thoughts on how that, in terms of Putin making that effort to have that meeting?
I don't see it as significant, to be honest. I mean, Putin's also met Steve Witkoff, who's just a real estate developer. So I think the important thing is that when there are big international disputes, I mean, Putin is willing to, meet people, parties involved in those kind of conflicts and have dialogue with them. Most of the work obviously will be done via Sergei Lavrov. But I just think it's part of Russian statecraft that actually they're open, the doors are open for dialogue, and Putin will meet visitors even if the main legwork is done by his foreign minister Lavrov. So I don't really see it as that significant. I mean, I think the interesting thing there is that you don't see that in terms of Western capitals. How often do you see kind of Western heads of government meeting sort of, foreign ministers? Very rarely happens. All these things are normally subordinated to kind of more junior people. In that regard, Putin is different in having a much more open door policy. That's just their style. It works for them, but I don't see it as particularly exceptional.
Keir Starmer has been adamant that he doesn't want to be part of this war, and yet we've seen a lot of engagement by the United Kingdom. We've seen, obviously, Diego Garcia being used, but not just that. We've seen a number of British, a lot of movement of British assets, and allegedly there are British assets now in the UAE attempting to defend the UAE. What's your thoughts on the UK and their involvement in this war?
Well, we're not really a part, and we shouldn't be a party to this war. But unfortunately, Trump is trying to drag us ever more sort of closely into this, and we've seen this fight from the start, from the initial refusal to allow the US to use, our bases in Diego Garcia and IF Fairford as well, in the United Kingdom, and then Keir Starmer doing a complete U-turn on that when he came under pressure to kind of send naval assets, and the kind of really, poor response to that, it taking HMS Dragon about 3 weeks to get to Cyprus, and that needing repairs twice along the way because we just have hardly any ships in our kind of Royal Navy. We've been in a slightly embarrassing way trying to kind of make Trump happy when, frankly, we don't have any real military capabilities to bring to bear. And in any case, it's not really our fight. So yet again, Starmer has found himself trying to pander to Trump because he sees that relationship as important and looking weak in the process.
What about the UK's kind of engagement in this Russia-Ukraine war? You know how bad it is in the UK. I mean, we're struggling significantly. The working class aren't in a great situation. People need a lot of help and support. What's the UK's perspective in this Russia-Ukraine war? It seems like, obviously, I know their perspective. What I mean is their kind of willingness to engage in a more additional mode or method.
Well, there hasn't been any willingness. And there hasn't been any willingness since 2014 when Philip Hammond became the Foreign Secretary. This isn't just a Labour Party issue. It's not really just a Keir Starmer issue. It's a UK issue. The fact that we've invested in this idea that we should support Ukraine come what may, we should cut off all diplomatic dialogue with Russia, we should pursue economic sanctions, even as evidence mounts that sanctions hurt us more than they hurt Russia. And we believe in this bizarre concept of inflicting a strategic victory on a country with the biggest nuclear arsenal in the world, with the biggest territory in the world, rich in natural resources, which is Russia. And that is a position that hasn't changed. Keir Starmer came in as somebody who really wasn't that interested in foreign policy issue more than domestic policy issues. He's tried to pivot to show himself as some statesman on the world stage. He's failed. UK policy hasn't changed. Ukraine is bankrupt and increasingly a broken state. And we have no answers to that apart from to keep giving them money to keep fighting on when they can't win.
And I guess that's my question. Why is it the UK has continued to provide money? Is it just their kind of loyalty to this whole Ukraine situation? Because we're not benefiting, Ukraine's not benefiting, Europe's not benefiting. All of them are becoming weakened because of it. What's the kind of? It's not. And what I mean by that is, it's obviously a decision making of the previous government, and yet this government is continuing on with that and actually being a lot more supportive, especially when you look at a lot of Keir Starmer's statements.
Part of it is herd mentality. We're all just following the herd like a bunch of lemmings, unable to kind of course correct as the cliff edge gets ever closer and we get closer to kind of running off the edge of it. Part of it is that we're bang out of ideas. Part of it is an underlying latent Russophobia. Part of it is the fact that the whole executive branch, the mainstream media in the United Kingdom is completely captured by this idea that Russia's bad, we're good, and we just need to kind of fight them to the end. And we will defeat them, and maybe one day we'll go to war to them too, even though our army is at its smallest state since it was in 1823, 200 years ago. So it's partly delusion as well. But in none of this do you see any calm-headed consideration of actually, the benefits to Ukraine itself by the war ending and it allowing itself to kind of be reconstructed, benefits to the UK in terms of the massive cost of living crisis, which is affecting working class people on a day-to-day basis, on which, the citizens of this country have voted today in quite a resounding way to reject, Keir Starmer's limp and bland and dull and uninspiring sort of government, of this country. And, I saw so many Labour talking heads today talking about the kind of leadership Keir Starmer is providing on the world stage. Well, he's not providing any leadership on the world stage, first thing. But secondly, that's not what British people care about. British people care about their kids feeling safe and happy, having jobs, seeing their incomes growing, having the potholes fixed, having people with zombie knives not being able to stab innocent kids in the streets, and all of those things. Nobody cares about Keir Starmer's preening attempts to be some sort of global statesman, which he isn't. They want the government to fix their problems, and he hasn't done that.
No doubt, no doubt. I don't think he's even respected on the world stage or by people throughout the world. Now, in terms of one last question about the UK, and we'll get back into the war. And in terms of the UK, we are or were hearing reports that there could be a possibility of a forced conscription at some point. Do you think that's a possibility, or do you think that's a very, very minimal in terms of if the UK was to engage in some kind of kinetic war and join the Russia-Ukraine war?
Well, my question to that is well, why can't we pursue diplomacy? We haven't tried it for 12 years since the Ukraine crisis started. Let's try it now. So before we even contemplate going to war with Russia, which is a completely ridiculous idea, by the way, our army is tiny. We could barely send one Type 45 destroyer to, Cyprus without it having to be fixed several times along the way. Let's get real about this. Having a big war against Russia serves nobody's interests and will end up getting us all killed. Well, instead of just going straight to the point of nuclear immolation, why don't we think about trying diplomacy again? we're well out of practice in the UK. Maybe now's the time to restart that.
Yeah, yeah. Now, and I totally agree with you. And I remember it was Boris Johnson who kind of destroyed all peace efforts previously.
It
So
was. It was. Yeah,
we've
like I said, it's not a Labour Party, it's not a Conservative Party, it's not even the Lib Dems because they're as warmongering as the Tories and the Labour. This uniparty which has a stranglehold over our foreign policy these days. It's all of them. They are all trapped by this kind of delusion.
and it's all parties, even the alternative parties are so supportive of war that we really don't have an option in the UK at all when it comes to political choice. But coming back to the Iran war, we've seen kind of diplomacy not work. Now we've seen in the Strait of Hormuz major escalation. Where do you see this going? Because you're seeing, for example, today we saw the United States of America strike an Iranian vessel, two vessels, killing 5 innocent civilians. I mean, and then Iran just came out and said they hit a US destroyer. How far does this go?
Well, America's gamble is that Iran is going to run out of oil, wealth, and will have to kind of come to its knees and agree to some sort of diplomatic settlement on terms that aren't favorable to Iran. Well, there's no evidence that that is the case. I mean, Iran still has some reserves. It can probably still keep fighting, even if the US manages to choke off all of Iran's oil exports over the next kind of few weeks. Iran can probably keep going for another few months with declining income from that kind of US blockade. So that's one thing. I mean, if that happens, what happens to the world economy if the Americans keep firing oil tankers, killing innocent civilians on board those oil tankers? Well, apart from the fact that it'll radicalize world, opinion against the United States, itself, including in the developing world, but also actually in parts of the Western world too, including here, in the United Kingdom, the global economy will go even into an even deeper meltdown than it's already headed for, as Trump believes that he can somehow economically bring Iran to its knees by choking off its kind of oil income in circumstances where Iran has been sanctioned since 1979 and sanctions have had no impact at all. So, so again, it's completely delusional and, just give it a rest. He's gone in, he had no strategy. He has got insufficient troops, to invade. And actually, Iran is a country the size of Western Europe, and the whole idea is bizarre when you think about what happened in the US intervention in Iraq from 2003 onwards. He's failed. He's failing. The world economy is sinking further and further into a big depression ahead. Let's not make it any worse. Let's just finish it now and just whatever he wants to do is try and polish this failure as a success to his people. Well, have at it on Truth Social with all the posts that you want to kind of issue. But let's be serious and let's get into diplomacy and bring this silly war to an end.
I guess the question is, does he really want the war to end? And what I mean by that is, when we spoke at the start of this interview, I mentioned 3 or 4 major incidences which resulted in major wealth transfer from the working class to the oligarchs or corporations. And if you look at what's happening in this war, he's got a blockade on. Poor countries are struggling significantly. And then Europe is really having huge problems. American allies are having major problems. And that includes Europe. But Trump himself is benefiting financially. You look at many of the trades that are being put in, it seems like he's enriching himself quite a bit. And so does he really want this to end? Because if the goal is to kind of create this wealth transfer, if the goal is to basically benefit the corporations, then the blockade's brilliant, right?
Well, it is, and it was forever thus, right? I mean, wars don't benefit ordinary working class people. If you walk into your local town or village or city, wherever in the United Kingdom or in any country, you'll find people who they don't really care about what's happening on the world stage. They care about what's happening in their local communities. They care about the quality of the public services they're receiving. They want their kids to feel safe and happy. They want opportunities to get work and earn an income and have food to put on the table every day. These are the things that ordinary people care about. They don't want to be dragged off the streets and forced into a uniform because some very rich person has decided to fight a war in a far-off country they've never heard of and have never really understood and been to.
Yeah.
They just want to think about their day-to-day concerns, and that's what you're seeing in the election results, of course, today in the United Kingdom, which has seen a complete wipeout for the Labour Party right here. So yeah, we know that wars make the wealthy even more wealthy. We know that they just support the military-industrial complex and just feed the pockets of the fat cats that run those big corporations. We know all these things, and I think what we're starting to see across politics in the United Kingdom, in actually in Europe as well, more broadly, in France and Germany and Central Europe and so on, is ordinary voters saying, well, why don't we have governments that actually think about us first and forget about all these stupid wars and think about our needs? And I think that's a political transition we're starting to see across Britain and Europe right now, and I hope that continues.
No doubt, no doubt. I think the people are realizing that. Well, my issue is this: the people are realizing that the governments aren't doing the right thing for them. But the problem is, just like in the past, they just think a changeover to the next one is just going to benefit without really understanding that are any of these groups or political parties really representative of your ideas and thoughts, and will it bring the country back to away
Yeah.
or back to where it was or away from
Yeah.
the problems that it's facing, right?
Yeah, I think that's true. But I also think social media has really kind of changed the nature of democracy as well. I think the speed with which information flows, the access to information in the alternative media space, including through your very good podcast, means that ordinary folk can have access to information that's outside of the bland and very managed and choreographed mainstream slop that you see on the BBC and other kind of mainstream channels. So I think actually because of that, political mobilization is rising. People have access to kind of better sources of information. They're curious. They have these questions, and they're finding information that they're throwing up answers in their minds and questions about their governments about why they're being failed on a day-to-day basis in foreign lands when our streets are full of potholes and kids are being murdered in the streets. So I think that's changing the nature of how democracy works in our country in real time and in countries across Europe. And I see that as only a good time. I mean, there has to be kind of wider implications for our political system as well, in terms of what we have these elections every 4 years. Is that too long? Because you've seen in the U.S., Trump came in promising to do all these things, promising to kind of help the blue collar workers, promising to reindustrialize America, promising to provide jobs, reduce reliance on Wall Street oligarchs and that sort of thing, promising to end forever wars. He's done none of those things. He's done completely the opposite. And actually he's given himself a 4-year term in office, uncontested. I mean, he's got the midterms coming up in November. So that is a separate problem in democracy that I hope we can figure out ways to sort out. But I think today's results is a positive sign for the health of our democracy, that actually people saying to Keir Starmer and other globalists will actually put our needs first.
Yeah, I guess, but the other problem with that is if you were to reduce the time period, that actually harms development. Like one of my actual issues that I have got with democracy is even the 4 years seem too short. So like a politician comes in, 4 years is not enough, and then he's already thinking about being re-elected again. He's not really putting in the real lasting changes. Like somewhere like Russia, the reason Putin was able to put in the lasting changes because he's been in charge for so long. The reason Xi and China has developed so much is because you've always had Xi. If Xi thought he was going to be replaced in 2-3 years, maybe you wouldn't have had the development. So shorter could be good, but I don't know. I think maybe longer might be better, actually.
Yeah, I mean that's true too. I mean, because there are two separate issues there, right? There's the actual politicians, at the top, the people are elected. Then there's a deep state, and that's a problem that we have, which I suppose you have less in Russia, places like Russia and China, where their whole kind of political settlement is on a totally different basis. So one of the problems we have in the UK is that the executive has too much power. All these kind of grey faces behind the scenes, can influence kind of what happens, and you need elected people to kind of hold them to account as well. So look, there are no easy solutions to this, except to say that our political settlement in the UK isn't working, is failing ordinary working class people. We're all getting poorer, we're getting less safe, we're being threatened with forced conscription for wars that we didn't sign up to. We need some sort of a change, and the Labour Party, the Conservative, the Lib Dems, all these mainstream parties don't seem to be the ones that do that. And just to be clear, I don't support any. I'm politically independent. I don't support any political party, so I'm not making a pitch for the Greens, Reform, or anybody else. I just want politicians who actually put the needs of, because I'm, believe it or not, even as a British diplomat, I'm a working class from a very working class family. I want ordinary people's needs to be thought of first.
Where are you from?
Well, I'm actually from Southampton, but my dad's from the northeast of England, from Gateshead area. He grew up in a colliery village, and obviously all the pits were closed in the 1980s. You know about that during UK's own deindustrialisation. But yeah, my dad's a Geordie. My mum was, from the Southampton area.
Nice. I'm from Middlesbrough, so you're from the right place.
Well, Southampton are playing Middlesbrough tomorrow, so I'm hoping. Sorry, but I'm hoping that we beat you.
Well, I don't know. Up the borough. That's what we're gonna say. Just coming back to it, just one last question before, because I know you need to head off. Just from your understanding of like negotiations, being a British diplomat, where do you think things go from now? Where do you think, what do we see in the next, I don't know, week or 2 weeks, or even in the distant future?
So there are two aspects to this. One is some sort of arrangement to bring the conflict to a close, with the main issues already having been agreed, like on economic relief for Iran, like on some assurances on future attacks, like on the other kind of allies in the axis of resistance, in the Middle East as well. Some assurances there. The Americans will want some sort of broad assurances on nuclear issues and so on and so forth. But I mean, there will have to be some sort of detailed agreement, which may take longer because, the negotiation of these texts can be quite a long, drawn-out process. So I think Iran will want, and I think the Americans will want, some sort of formulation, some sort of big agreement that maybe the Chinese and the Russians co-sponsor, like a JCPOA version 2 sort of thing. So I think the Iranians will want something in treaty language that is legally binding on the US and on, of course, Israel, that it's not going to be threatened, with attacks again in the future. That process will take a long time. If you're just sending in people like Witkoff and Kushner, they're not the people to do that work. Quite frankly, you need serious diplomats behind closed doors working on that over a period of time to get the deal that every side can agree with.
One last question. I know I was going to let you go, but how can you have a deal? Because this is the common problem we have. And I think this is something Iran needs to think about is whenever you make a deal with Israel, they never abide by it. So we're seeing now there's a deal in Gaza. There's a ceasefire in Gaza, but Gaza is being bombed almost every day. There was a ceasefire in Lebanon from 2024 to 2026. They continue to bomb. And even during this ceasefire, they continue to do so. So my problem is that if Iran was to agree to a deal with Lebanon included, that won't make a difference in the sense of it'll end up being a one-way deal, and then Israel will continue bombing Lebanon, and you're kind of in a situation where you've left them out in the cold.
Well, that's the difference between a ceasefire and an actual agreement, right? An agreement should be an all-encompassing thing that's legally binding. A ceasefire, anybody can breach it at any time. There's theoretically a ceasefire in Iran against Iran now, but actually they're still attacking ships in the Straits of Hormuz, and so on. So, I mean, ceasefires are necessarily quite fragile things because there are always incentives on both sides to break it, and they'll always claim, well, they did something, so we had to do something in return, and this sort of nonsense. An agreement is a treaty which is legally binding. It's easier to enforce that. And actually, in terms of the court of world public opinion, I think Israel has done a fantastic job in radicalizing world opinion against itself with its actions in Gaza, in Lebanon, and of course in terms of this ill thought through kind of war against Iran. I mean, they need to think about their positioning long term as well. I mean, they're not necessarily going to be a party to this agreement, but the Americans have a job in their hands to actually make sure the Israelis are going to stick to any deal that's agreed and not keep breaching it as they kind of pursue their own territorial ambitions.
No doubt. Ian, thank you so much for taking your time out to join us. Always appreciate it. Well, this is the first time, so I really appreciate you coming on. Thank you so much. Where can people find you and find your work?
Well, I'm the Peacemonger. I'm at Ian Proud. I'm on YouTube. I'm just recently started a couple of months ago, and also on Substack at the Peacemonger. So I am the Peacemonger, not a warmonger. So clues in the name.
We love the peacemongers. We don't like the warmongers. So everybody make sure you follow Ian's Substack and follow his YouTube. Thank you so much for taking your time out to join us. Appreciate it.
Come on, you saints.
Thank you. Up the borough. Thank you so much, Ian. Appreciate it. See you later. Thank you. That was Ian. Make sure you follow him on YouTube. Make sure you follow him on Substack. Like this video, comment in this video, subscribe to the channel, put your notifications on. Let me know your thoughts. What did you think about what he had to say? Do you agree with him in terms of his viewpoint about the United Kingdom? Do you disagree with him? Let me know your thoughts in the comments. Like, comment, and subscribe. Have your notifications on. Subscribe.